Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. I'd love to know. And if you enjoy these kinds of stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. All right, let's jump in. It all started like any other day. The kind of day where everything felt just right, where nothing seemed out of the ordinary. People were rushing to work, kids were talking about their school day, and the hum of life carried on as it always did. The air was thick with the usual chatter of the world moving forward, completely unaware of the storm that was about to rip it apart. Then, without warning, the sky shattered. At first it looked like some strange weather event, clouds swirling in ways they shouldn't. But it wasn't just clouds, no. The sky tore apart in a jagged line, a massive gash across the heavens. And from that rip came ships, huge, menacing things, darker than night, like the very darkness had come alive. They hovered silently, their presence an uninvited shadow blocking out the sun. Their engines hummed with a deep, unsettling vibration that made the ground shake, a sound so unnatural it seemed to scrape against the air itself. People didn't know what to think. Was it a freak occurrence? A military test gone wrong? Then, the destruction came. The first blast didn't come from a gun. It didn't come from anything the world had ever seen. It was like the city just disappeared. New York, Paris, Tokyo, all of it. Erased, as if it had never been there. No explosions, no smoke, just nothing. Gone. The governments of the world scrambled to respond, sending jets and launching missiles, but nothing worked. The ships didn't move, didn't flinch. Every missile got obliterated before it could even reach them. Every plane was reduced to a burning wreck before it had a chance to fire. The invaders didn't care. They didn't negotiate. They didn't offer terms. They came to wipe us off the face of the earth, and nothing would stop them. And just like that, fear took hold of every soul on the planet. People looked to the sky and felt something in their gut, the cold, heavy feeling of inevitability. There was nothing they could do. They were fighting a war they didn't even understand. The ships didn't just invade, they came to dominate. Humanity was weak, powerless in the face of this. But there was one thing the invaders hadn't accounted for, one thing they hadn't understood about the humans they were trying to destroy. We don't quit, not when it matters. And when you corner us, when we've got nowhere to go, we don't back down. In a small, forgotten town in Montana, a man named Marcus Lane was about to prove that. While the world burned, Marcus got to work. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He did what only a human could do. He fought back. Marcus Lane wasn't a soldier. He wasn't even someone who had ever wanted to fight. He had spent most of his life quietly working as an engineer, building things no one ever heard of, designing weapons for the military, and then quietly watching as those weapons were buried deep in the vaults of the government. He wasn't the hero type. He wasn't the kind of guy who ever thought he'd be standing in the middle of a crisis like this. Yet here he was, in the basement of his old house, welding together the pieces of a broken world, crafting the last hope humanity had left. He didn't know how long he'd been working. 3 days, maybe 4. Time seemed to have no meaning anymore. His hands were shaking, and his eyes burned from lack of sleep, but he pushed through. Every once in a while, he would hear the distant rumble of explosions from the cities being obliterated, the screams of a world coming undone. But Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't have time to flinch. The weapon he was building wasn't much to look at. If you'd seen it, you might have thought it was a piece of junk. A giant, rusted satellite dish, bolted to the back of a rusty old pickup truck. The kind of thing a drunken redneck might build to try and fix his TV reception. But Marcus wasn't worried about appearances. This thing, this mess of metal and wires, was his one shot at saving Earth. As he connected the final wires, he took a deep breath. The hum of the alien ships in the sky seemed to vibrate through his bones. The world was already dying, and here he was, clinging to the fragile thread of human ingenuity. It was all they had left. But Marcus was used to feeling out of his depth. He had spent his career working with things that shouldn't have worked. The military had buried his projects because they were too dangerous, too experimental, too unstable. They didn't want to risk it. But now, there was no time for fear. The world needed a miracle, and Marcus Lane was about to give it to them. He climbed into the truck, his fingers trembling as he switched the device on. At first, nothing happened. He thought for a moment that it was all for nothing, that the world was already doomed. But then, with a crackling hum, the dish came to life. A pulse of energy shot out, arcing toward the sky. For a second, Marcus didn't know if it had worked. Then the impossible happened. One of the alien ships above them flickered. There was no explosion, no grand display of fire and destruction. It simply vanished. One moment it was there, massive and terrifying, hovering in the sky, and the next moment, it was gone. Not even a scrap of metal was left behind. It was like it had never existed at all. Marcus blinked in disbelief. He didn't understand what he'd just done, but it worked. The invaders had never expected this. They had never imagined that someone, somewhere on Earth, would actually have the nerve to fight back, let alone the means to do so. For the first time since they arrived, there was a shift. The ships stopped moving, a momentary hesitation. They didn't know what to do. They hadn't expected humanity to have anything that could hurt them. But Marcus knew they wouldn't stay confused for long. They had underestimated humanity once, and they wouldn't make that mistake again. He didn't know if his device would hold up for long, but he wasn't going to let that stop him. He grabbed the old CB radio sitting on the truck's dashboard, and with a shaky breath, he broadcasted the message. Earth to the invaders, attack again, and face total annihilation. The words echoed into the vast emptiness of space, hanging in the air like a challenge. Marcus's voice cracked, rough and worn from days of exhaustion and panic, but it was clear, it was direct, and it was the only thing he could offer to the world in this moment of terror. For a long time, there was nothing. No response, no movement. It was like the universe itself had gone silent. Marcus could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he waited. This could be the moment that defined everything. He could already feel it, the strange, electrifying sensation that this was bigger than just him, bigger than his little town or his small corner of the world. And then finally the ships began to retreat. It wasn't in a flurry of activity. No massive blasts or hasty retreats. They simply turned and vanished, slipping back through the rift in the sky like shadows fading into the night. The hole in the sky sealed itself up with a soft, almost undetectable hum, and the heavy weight of the invasion was gone. For the first time since it all began, the sky above was clear. The earth, though still scarred and burning, felt a breath of relief. But Marcus wasn't celebrating. He knew better than anyone that this wasn't the end. It wasn't even close. He sat there, staring at the device still humming softly in the back of the truck. The people in his town, the few survivors that hadn't already run or been wiped out, were beginning to pour into the streets. They didn't know what had happened, why the ships had vanished, but they were starting to realize. Some cried, some laughed, others just stared at the sky, unable to believe it was finally over. Marcus knew better. He knew that the invaders would come back, stronger, smarter, and more prepared. And the rest of the world? They didn't understand what they were dealing with. They didn't know how the weapon worked, or why it had worked at all. Hell, Marcus didn't even know himself. He had thrown it together in a fevered panic, using military tech, wild ideas, and whatever scraps he could get his hands on. He had no idea what he had just unleashed. The government didn't understand that either. Soon, helicopters were circling above his town, landing in the fields outside. Black-suited men with mirrored sunglasses spilled out, flooding the streets with orders. The UN, the US government, European leaders. They were all there, all pushing to take control of the weapon, to seize Marcus's creation and figure out how to replicate it. They weren't there to thank him. They were there to control him. Marcus didn't care about their politics. He didn't care about their threats or their bribery. He had seen too much. He had lived through the kind of world where power was taken by force. He knew that nothing would change if they took the device. They would bury it, just like they buried everything else. Keep it hidden, keep it secret, and use it only when they saw fit. That wasn't going to happen. Sitting on the crumbling porch of his home, a shotgun resting lazily across his lap, Marcus didn't speak. He didn't need to. He let the world come to him, the men in black suits, the soldiers with their fancy uniforms, all trying to force him into submission. They didn't know who they were dealing with. For 2 days, they argued. They tried everything. They used words, they used threats, they used promises of power. But Marcus didn't move. He stayed silent, calm, and cold in his refusal. The world outside the town was burning, but for the moment, Marcus was still standing. And he was ready for whatever came next. He wasn't the hero they wanted, but he was the hero they needed. And he wasn't about to give up without a fight. The standoff between Marcus and the government forces continued. The men in black suits, led by a cold-eyed commander from the United Nations, seemed to believe that their authority was enough to bend Marcus to their will. They had come with legal papers, accusations of treason, and promises of global security. But Marcus wasn't interested in their grand plans. He had seen too much to believe in the bureaucracy of the world, especially when the fate of the human race rested on his shoulders. For 2 days, Marcus sat in his rickety old chair, his shotgun resting across his knees like a silent sentinel. The soldiers and officials grew more impatient, more agitated, but Marcus remained as calm as a man waiting for a storm to pass. Every now and then, he would glance at the alien device, still humming softly in the back of his truck, a reminder of what they all needed. What the world needed. The whole world was waiting for Marcus to break, to give in to the pressure. But the people of his town, the survivors who had lived through hell, weren't about to let that happen. As the second day wore on, more and more of them began to gather on the streets. Some were armed with old hunting rifles, others with handguns, or even makeshift weapons. Bats, pipes, anything they could find. They were angry, tired, and ready to stand their ground. They had watched their homes burn, their families die, and they weren't going to let these government forces take the one thing that had saved them. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky a blood-red hue, the government forces made their move. They came in the dead of night, under the cover of darkness, with helicopters buzzing overhead and masked soldiers creeping through the streets. They thought they could strike quickly, quietly, swoop in and seize the weapon before anyone noticed. But they had underestimated the people of Montana, and they had underestimated Marcus. As soon as the first soldier set foot on the dirt road leading into town, the trap was sprung. A single shot rang out in the distance, then another, and another. The soldiers froze, confused. They had been expecting quiet, unopposed resistance. What they got was something far worse, an entire town ready to fight for its survival. The people of the town had prepared, each person having taken a position, some in the hills surrounding the town, others hidden behind trees or crouched in shadows, watching When the soldiers made their move, the town's residents sprang into action. Homemade bombs, rigged traps, and sniper fire rained down on the soldiers. The military was used to fighting conventional wars where they had the upper hand. They had never faced anything like this before. This wasn't a battle for territory. This was a fight for survival, and the people of this town weren't going to just roll over. Gunfire erupted, and chaos filled the air. The soldiers weren't ready for guerrilla tactics, hit and run, surprise attacks, and sudden bursts of fire. They were used to operating in controlled zones, with clear orders and a singular mission. But here, in the backwater of Montana, they found themselves fighting against a force that knew the land, knew the shadows, knew how to make every corner a deadly ambush. The soldiers were getting picked off, one by one. Some managed to return fire, but the town fought with the desperation of people who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. Marcus watched from his porch, still sitting quietly with his shotgun resting on his lap. He didn't need to fight this battle. The people had it under control. They were fighting for their homes, their families, and for the hope that had been rekindled when the alien ships disappeared. But Marcus knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The government wasn't going to let it end like this, and the aliens would be back. The next few hours were a blur of gunshots and explosions, the night air thick with smoke and dust. The soldiers began to fall back, retreating into the night, their pride and morale shattered. They hadn't expected this kind of resistance. They hadn't expected the town to fight so fiercely, to fight so smartly. It wasn't a victory, not yet. But it was a defeat for the government forces. They had underestimated the people of this town, and now they were paying the price. As dawn broke, the last of the military forces had retreated, leaving behind a battlefield littered with wreckage and the remains of their once pristine uniforms. The survivors of the town began to emerge from their hiding places, their faces grim but resolute. They had won this battle, but they all knew it wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Marcus stood up slowly, stretching his sore muscles. His eyes scanned the horizon, and for a moment he allowed himself a brief, tired smile. The world outside was still burning, but they had won something tonight. They had proven that Earth wouldn't be conquered without a fight. But the battle wasn't over. The alien threat was still out there, and the governments of the world would soon be knocking at his door again. Marcus had a feeling the world's leaders would be less polite this time. He had no idea how long they had before the invaders returned, but he wasn't going to sit idly by and wait. He had seen enough of the world's leaders to know that they would do whatever it took to control the situation. And that meant they would come for him, for his weapon. As he walked through the streets, Marcus couldn't help but notice the change in the town's atmosphere. It was still tense, still raw with the trauma of everything they had gone through. But there was something else now, something that hadn't been there before. The spark of defiance. The people of this town had fought back, not because they were soldiers, but because they had no choice. And in doing so, they had shown the world that Earth wasn't going to roll over and die. It wasn't going to be erased from the map. "Marcus," a voice called, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was General Teague, the commander of the Earth Defense Forces, his face weary but determined. He had been a part of the initial resistance effort, but like everyone else, he had learned the hard way that the government didn't have all the answers. "General," Marcus said, giving him a tired nod. "What's left of the government forces?" "They're licking their wounds, but they won't be down for long. We'll have to keep moving," Teague replied, his voice low but steady. Marcus gave a grim smile. "Then we better get moving, too." They had little time. The world had begun to rebuild in the wake of the alien retreat, but they all knew that the invaders would return. They would come back stronger, faster, and more determined. And when they did, the world would need to be ready. But ready for what? No one knew. The technology the aliens possessed was beyond anything Earth could even begin to understand. It wasn't just about building weapons anymore. It was about learning to survive in a galaxy where humanity was nothing more than a speck of dust. As Marcus stood there, looking out over the town that had just fought to keep its independence, he knew the real battle had just begun. The governments of the world might want to control the weapon he had built, but they weren't the ones who would have to face the next wave of alien invaders. That would be up to him, and the people who were willing to fight, not for power, not for control, but for their very survival. He knew one thing for certain. If the aliens thought they had broken humanity, they were in for a rude awakening. Marcus Lane wasn't done yet. The world hadn't seen anything yet. The days following the battle felt surreal. The town of Marcus Lane had won, but it had come at a terrible price. Buildings were charred and broken, the streets covered in debris, and the air thick with the scent of smoke and dust. Yet there was a strange sense of defiance that hung over the place. The people had done the impossible. They had fought back, not just with weapons, but with the fierce resolve of those who had nothing left to lose. Marcus walked through the streets, his boots crunching on the rubble as he passed familiar faces. The people were different now. They weren't the frightened survivors of a world under siege. They were fighters. Their eyes had that same fire he had seen in his own reflection after the first alien ship vanished. It was the look of someone who had realized they could survive, and not just survive, but stand against the odds. The government forces, once so powerful and confident, had retreated, their pride bruised. The soldiers and high-ranking officials who had thought they could simply take Marcus's weapon and control the situation had learned a painful lesson. They were not in control anymore. And neither were the aliens. Earth had sent them a message, and though it was barely a whisper in the vastness of space, it was heard. We will not go quietly. Marcus felt a deep weariness settle into his bones. He had led the defense of his town, but that was just one small piece of the larger picture. He had only delayed the inevitable. He had only bought the world time. The invaders would return, and when they did, they wouldn't make the same mistakes twice. They would come back stronger, better prepared, and with a new sense of purpose. The first wave had been about dominance. The second would be about destruction. As he made his way back to his home, the familiar sight of the truck with the alien device still strapped to its back greeted him. He had spent the last few days in a haze, focused only on the immediate survival of his town. But now, as he looked at the device again, his mind began to race. He had no idea how it worked, what kind of technology it used, how it had managed to wipe out that alien ship without a single trace. He didn't even understand the science behind it. All he knew was that it had worked, and he had no idea if it would work again, or if the aliens would learn to counter it. "Marcus, you're looking worse than usual," General Teague said, his voice rough with fatigue. He had joined Marcus by the truck, his face a portrait of weariness, but also determination. The general had been a rock through all of this, trying to keep the military coordinated, to keep the world's governments together in the face of chaos. But even he knew that this battle, and the one to come, wasn't something they could win with traditional tactics. They needed something new, something they didn't have. "I'm not tired," Marcus replied flatly. "I'm just trying to figure out what happens next. We bought ourselves time, but for what?" Teague took a long breath, running a hand over his tired face. "We've got the weapon, or at least we know how to build one. The world's scrambling to reverse engineer what you made, but the truth is, it'll take months, maybe even years, before we have anything like it ready. And even then, who knows if it'll work a second time? The aliens don't operate like we do. They have tech we can't even begin to understand." "That's the problem," Marcus muttered. "I don't know how this thing works. I built it out of scraps, off-the-book military junk, and whatever wild ideas I had. Hell, I wasn't even sure it was going to work when I turned it on. And now we're supposed to use it again? Teague's gaze hardened. We have to. We can't afford to waste this opportunity. The aliens won't just sit back after this. They'll regroup. And when they do, they'll be back in full force. We have to be ready. Marcus ran his hand through his hair, frustrated. I don't even know where to start. I didn't write down anything. No notes, no plans. I didn't think I'd be alive long enough to need them. Hell, I didn't even expect it to work at all. Then we need to fix that. The world needs you, Marcus, Teague said, his voice unwavering. The Resistance needs you. We're going to need your mind more than anything else, and we need to figure out how to take this device and make it work for us, or it's all for nothing. Marcus nodded slowly, but a sense of dread started creeping into his gut. He had always worked alone. He was a problem solver, not a leader. But now, for the first time, he realized how much the weight of the world was resting on his shoulders. The people in his town had already made their choice. They were going to fight. But the rest of the world wasn't there yet. The world governments were scrambling, pointing fingers, trying to figure out who had the best plan. But none of them had the answers. Marcus had seen the fear in their eyes when they realized they didn't have a clue how to fight these invaders. They didn't have anything close to the weapon he had built. And they didn't understand the desperation that had fueled its creation. I'll see what I can do, Marcus said, his voice quieter than before. But I can't promise anything. Teague nodded, then turned and walked away, leaving Marcus alone with the truck and the humming device. He knew the time for hesitation was over. They were out of options. The world was on the brink of collapse, and there was no time left for mistakes. He had already given everything to build this weapon. Now he had to give everything to understand it, and to make sure it would work again when the invaders came back. In the days that followed, Marcus worked tirelessly, with the help of a few trusted individuals who had remained behind in the town. He couldn't rely on the military or the governments. They had their own agenda, their own motives, and they would try to take the credit for whatever happened next. No, Marcus had to do this himself. He had to figure out the device, piece by piece, and see if he could make it work again. Late into the nights, Marcus sat at a makeshift workbench in his garage, surrounded by wires, circuit boards, and old military manuals. The device was so far beyond anything humanity had ever seen that it seemed almost impossible to comprehend. But Marcus was used to working with things no one else could understand. He had designed weapons no one dared use. Now, he was facing the same kind of problem. How do you fight an enemy that's far beyond you? How do you fight when your only hope is something you can't even begin to explain? It was in the quiet, late hours of one such night that Marcus finally found something. A small clue hidden within the schematics of the device. It was a tiny fragment of something he hadn't seen before. A series of numbers etched into the metal, almost as if the device was trying to communicate with him. It was like a code, one that had been buried deep within its circuitry. Marcus's heart skipped a beat as he connected the dots. This was it. This was the key to understanding how the device worked. Marcus leaned over the workbench, his eyes fixed on the small piece of circuitry in front of him. His fingers trembled slightly as he carefully traced the intricate web of wires and components with his eyes, following the faint markings that had eluded him before. He felt the weight of the task pressing down on him. The fate of humanity seemed to rest on understanding this one piece of technology, and so far it had been nothing but an enigma. The alien device had worked once, and that alone was enough to give humanity a glimmer of hope. But what if it didn't work again? What if it was a one-time fluke? He couldn't afford to think like that. Marcus pushed the doubt aside and focused on the clue he had uncovered. The numbers. The strange set of digits embedded within the device's metal frame. It wasn't much, just a sequence that seemed out of place. But to Marcus, it was the answer he'd been searching for. He reached for an old notebook, one he had used back when he was working on classified military projects. The pages were yellowed, some of the ink faded, but it was a familiar comfort, a place where he had once written down ideas that had changed the course of history. His hands moved quickly now, scribbling the sequence of numbers in the margins, trying to make sense of them. His mind raced through the possibilities. Could it be a code? Some kind of algorithm that explained the device's function? Or was it something else entirely? He paused for a moment, fingers still poised over the paper, and thought back to the days he had spent locked away in government labs, working on weapons that were too dangerous for the world to know about. The tech he had built, often rushed, always dangerous, had never been designed for something like this. But in his desperation, he had somehow stumbled across the one thing that might save Earth. And now, it seemed like that same desperation was leading him into unknown territory, one where failure wasn't just an option. It was a certainty. But Marcus wasn't about to fail, not when he knew that his world was on the line. He placed the notebook down and began fiddling with the wires, connecting and reconnecting, trying different configurations, all the while watching the alien device closely. It was silent, almost mocking in its stillness. It seemed like a simple machine, but underneath, it was so much more. A web of technology that was beyond anything humanity could fathom, and yet somehow Marcus had tapped into it. As the hours wore on, the silence in the room grew heavier, the weight of isolation pressing down on him. Outside, the world had begun to rebuild itself, piece by piece. Cities were rising from the ashes. Trade routes were reopening, and for a moment it seemed like Earth was slowly clawing its way back to normalcy. But Marcus knew better. The invaders would return. They had sent their message loud and clear. We will come back stronger. We will take what is ours. And when they did, they would be ready. The world had to be ready. Marcus wiped a bead of sweat from his brow and, without thinking, grabbed a nearby tool. He began working again, more intently now, tweaking the wires, adjusting the power settings. His mind was consumed by the puzzle in front of him, but somewhere deep inside, a gnawing fear tugged at him. What if this was all for nothing? What if the invaders were already planning their next move, a move so devastating that nothing could stop them? The hours stretched on. Midnight passed, and the weight of exhaustion began to settle into Marcus's muscles. He was too tired to think clearly, too drained to focus on the task at hand. His eyelids were heavy, and his body ached from days of relentless work, but he couldn't afford to rest. Not yet. And then, as if in answer to his frustration, the device hummed. Marcus jumped back, his heart racing in his chest. The hum grew louder, then steadied into a rhythmic pulse. The room seemed to vibrate with it. For a moment, Marcus could only stare at the device in disbelief. Had he done it? Had he finally figured it out? He took a deep breath and approached the device slowly, cautiously. The hum was a low, steady sound, almost like a heartbeat. He could feel the energy in the air, a subtle crackling that seemed to wrap around him like a blanket. He hesitated, fingers hovering just above the controls. If he made a mistake now, if he miscalculated even a fraction, everything could go wrong. The weapon could backfire, or worse, it could draw the attention of the invaders. But he had come this far. There was no turning back now. With trembling hands, Marcus activated the device. The low hum shifted, becoming sharper, more focused. The energy intensified, glowing faintly as the metal components inside the device seemed to pulse with power. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just a machine anymore. This was something alive, something far beyond anything humanity had ever created. It was a living, breathing piece of technology, and it was responding to him. The walls of the room seemed to bend with the energy, the air thickening as though the device was reaching out to something. But what? What was it connecting to? It wasn't just the alien ships it had responded to before. It was something else, something more. Suddenly, the hum stopped. Silence. Marcus stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. Had he failed? Had it all been a mistake? He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The world outside had faded away, leaving him alone in this small room with the alien technology that had become both his salvation and his curse. And then, the device activated. A burst of light exploded from the center of the satellite dish, a brilliant beam of energy that shot through the ceiling like a lightning bolt. The room shook violently as the beam cut through the air, extending upward into the night sky, tearing through the clouds. Marcus staggered backward, shielding his eyes from the blinding light. His mind raced. This wasn't just a test. This was something different, something far more powerful than anything he had expected. For a long moment, the light seemed to pulse in the sky, and then, as quickly as it had come, it vanished. The room fell silent once again. Marcus stood there, breathing heavily, his hands trembling. His mind was a blur of thoughts, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The beam had been unlike anything he had ever seen before. It wasn't just a weapon. It was something far more complex, something that could change the course of the war. But how? What had he just unleashed? The sound of approaching footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. He turned quickly to see General Teague and a few of his officers entering the room. Their faces were grim, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. "What the hell was that?" Teague asked, his voice hoarse. "I don't know," Marcus said, still trying to process the enormity of what had just happened. "But I think it worked. The device, it's responding. And I think it's ready." Teague exchanged a quick look with his men. "Ready for what? To fight back?" Marcus looked at the device again, his heart still pounding in his chest. Ready for everything. The room was thick with tension, the quiet after the burst of light almost deafening in its stillness. The energy from the device seemed to linger in the air, charged and heavy, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Marcus stood there, staring at the now dormant machine, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what had just happened. It had worked. He had made it work. But now the real question was, what would they do with it? Teague's voice cut through the silence, shaking Marcus from his daze. "Ready for everything? You mean, it's a weapon? But what's the range? How can we control it?" Marcus swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I don't know. This is all uncharted territory. I never built it with this in mind. But the energy is real, it's powerful, and it's connected to something beyond us, maybe beyond this planet." Teague stepped forward, eyes narrowing as he processed the information. "You're saying we've tapped into something alien? Something that could change the entire war?" Marcus nodded slowly, feeling a weight settling over him. "Yes, but that doesn't mean we can control it. We need to understand how it works. If we don't, then it's just a ticking time bomb. We could blow ourselves up trying to use it." The general's expression darkened. So, what now? Marcus didn't have an answer. He had no clue how the invaders would respond to what had just happened. Would they see it as a challenge? Would they come back stronger, more vengeful than before? Or had this been the very thing they feared, the thing that would force them to reconsider their conquest. His mind raced, but he knew that there was no time left. The invaders were coming. They always were. He could feel it in his bones. The brief moment of respite the world had gotten, the brief, flickering hope, was over. And humanity's response had to be swift and decisive. "We fight," Marcus said, the decision coming to him with clarity. "We fight with everything we have. We learn to control this thing. We find a way to make it our weapon, our advantage." Teague looked uncertain but resolute. "And if we can't, what happens then?" "Then we die fighting," Marcus said, his voice low but steady. He knew the gravity of his words. The future of humanity was uncertain, hanging by a thread. But there was no other choice. The aliens had come once and destroyed cities without mercy. They had wiped out millions in seconds. They wouldn't hesitate to do it again. And this time, humanity couldn't wait to be saved. This time, they had to stand their ground. The world's leaders were already preparing. The news was filled with reports of the defense weapon that had taken down one of the alien ships. Some spoke of it in awe. Others were already debating the risks, the potential fallout. Governments around the world scrambled to form coalitions, to pool resources, to build on the work Marcus had started. But there were whispers of power struggles, of hidden agendas, of nations jockeying for control. The very thing that could save humanity was also becoming a point of division. Marcus knew that they needed unity, not division. This weapon wasn't just a tool, it was a symbol of humanity's resilience. They couldn't afford to let the weight of their divisions crush them now. With the device still humming in the background, Marcus, Teague, and the rest of the resistance team began to work non-stop, reverse engineering every component of the alien tech they could. They had to make it work again. They had to understand what it could do. The clock was ticking. The invaders were coming. Days turned into weeks. The world's people rallied. The cities, though scarred by destruction, began to rebuild. Humanity's greatest asset, its ability to adapt, to survive, to fight, was now fully awake. The news was no longer filled with despair. Instead, it was filled with stories of hope, of fighters, of scientists, of engineers, all working together for one goal: survival. And then, one morning, the world got the message. It wasn't an explosion or a salvo of laser fire. It wasn't ships appearing on the horizon or loud declarations from the invaders. It was a single broadcast. The same kind of broadcast Marcus had sent out before, the same one that had made the invaders hesitate the first time. But this time, it wasn't from Earth. The message was short, simple. "We are coming. Prepare to face annihilation." Marcus felt a chill race down his spine as the words echoed through every communication channel on Earth. It wasn't a warning. It was a promise. The invaders weren't waiting for a signal. They were coming now. This time with full force. The Earth's last line of defense was ready. The weapon Marcus had created, now understood and amplified by the combined efforts of humanity's best minds, was at its peak. But it wasn't just about technology anymore. It was about something deeper. It was about defiance. In the face of extinction, humanity had stood together. They had faced impossible odds and fought with the tenacity that had defined their species since the dawn of time. No longer were they helpless. They weren't just defending their planet. They were defending their right to exist, to be more than just a blip in the cosmos. As the alien fleet appeared on the horizon, Marcus stood at the front lines once again. This time he wasn't alone. The resistance forces had mobilized, joined by the world's military. Every nation had set aside its differences to face this new threat. The device, the weapon, was ready to fire, ready to change the course of the battle. Marcus looked up at the sky, where the first of the alien ships were descending. They were huge, their dark forms blocking out the sun, casting a shadow over the earth. And there, in the midst of all the chaos, he saw the familiar hum of power, the energy building within the device. It wasn't just a machine anymore. It was humanity's declaration to the universe: we will not go quietly. The first shot was fired. The beam cut through the air, a brilliant streak of energy that shattered the closest alien ship like glass. The explosion was massive, sending shockwaves rippling through the atmosphere. The invaders hadn't anticipated this, hadn't prepared for Earth to strike back with the full fury of their defiance. But they would learn. As the battle raged, humanity fought with everything they had. Every shot, every strategy, every act of resistance pushed back against the invaders. The world was united, not just by fear, but by something stronger: hope. And in the heart of it all stood Marcus Lane, watching as the tide of battle began to turn, knowing that no matter the outcome, Earth had proven one irrefutable truth. They were not going to be wiped out, not without a fight.